Al Jazeera Podcasts.
Today, the UN's 80th General Assembly opens with Palestinian leaders on the sideline.
The Trump administration is canceling the visas of several Palestinian leaders ahead of the UN General Assembly in New York.
If Washington controls the guest list, what's left of UN neutrality, and what does it mean for Palestinian statehood? I'm Kevin Hirten, and this is The Take.
My name is Biesan Abu-Kwaik. I'm Al Jazeera Arabic's correspondent at the United Nations.
Okay. Well, Biesan, really good to have you back on the show. We're talking on Monday as the UN General Assembly is about to begin in New York. And the big story is not what's on the agenda, but who's not at the table. Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas and 80 other officials have been blocked from attending. So to start, just walk me through exactly what happened there.
So what is happening this year and on the sidelines, let's say, of the high-level meeting, there will be a resumption of a UN General Assembly session. What's being called is like the Two-State Solution Summit, and it's being co-chaired by Saudi Arabia and France. And in that summit, the expectation is several countries at the leadership of France will recognize the Palestinian statehood. You have two UN Security Council permanent members. France and the United Kingdom has so far said that they will recognize Palestine during that meeting. You have also Canada, Malta, Australia, and Belgium too. They're expected to recognize Palestine at that summit. So what's different this year is that the U.S. is not granting the Palestinian Authority and PLO members visas to come to New York and attend high-level week at the UN General Assembly.
This year, the familiar face of Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas will likely be missing, along with 80 members of his delegation after the Trump administration denied their visas. The State Department said that is, unless they condemn the October 7th attack, drop cases at the International Court of Justice and International Criminal Court, and stop seeking recognition of statehood.
We've heard the Trump administration has said that in their national interest to hold the PA and the PLO accountable for not complying with their commitments and for undermining prospects for peace. This was the statement that came out of the State Department when this announcement was made. So this year, this is what's different.
Yeah, this is really interesting language from Marco Rubio, not complying with their commitments for undermining the prospects of peace. I couldn't help but notice that Israel has been invited with open arms as usual. It's important to remind people that Israel's Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, has an arrest warrant out for war crimes. But the PA is the one undermining peace. We're not talking about Hamas here. We're talking about the Palestinian Authority. They aren't even at the negotiating table, right?
No, they're not.
Let me follow up if I could, because it sounds like we have two things going on.
Sure.
We have this historic effort led by Emmanuel Macron to recognize Palestinian statehood, and then you have this not unprecedented but very rare move to bar Palestinian representatives from coming to the UN this September. So, how are those two linked, in your opinion?
So we've heard statements from U.S. officials just a couple of days ago from the American ambassador in Israel, Mike Huckabee, basically say that the recognition will have disastrous consequences.
I don't know why people don't understand that unilateral Palestinian state is a violation of the Oslo Accords that everybody thought would lead to a Palestinian state.
At the same time, you have this position that the U.S. is taking in regard to the Palestinian Authority, basically calling on it to drop the efforts to secure this unilateral recognition. Also, there were statements made where they were basically saying that the PLO and the PA cannot be considered partners for peace, and they need to take efforts to repudiate terrorism.
So you have something that Israel clearly doesn't like, and then suddenly Israel's big brother, the U.S., comes in and bars the PA from coming in right ahead of the UN General Assembly. What have the reactions been across the board?
The spokesperson for the UN Secretary General has said that they have raised this issue directly with the US authorities, based obviously, as Sharik said, that under their obligations within the headquarters agreement and as the host country, that visas should be granted.
But obviously, I think that the participation of a senior Palestinian delegation to that conference seems to me essential for the topic that will be discussed.
Of course, the PA, Mahmoud Abbas's office, the head of the Palestinian Authority, the Palestinian president, they said that they were astonished regarding this decision, and they argued that it violates the UN headquarters agreement. The US, on the other hand, actually argues that they are not violating the agreement because they are allowing the Palestinian mission that is currently here at the UN to participate on behalf of the Palestinians. So not granting the visas, what they are saying, does not violate the agreement because there will be Palestinian representation by the...
And what about
mission.
the international community? It's been a bit silent, hasn't it?
The French President Emmanuel Macron last week, after speaking with the Saudi Crown Prince in a tweet, he described the decision as unacceptable, and he called for these measures to be reversed and for Palestinian representation to be ensured in accordance with the host country agreement. But they are still going forward with this with this summit and this high-level meeting on the sidelines of UNRWA. Also, on the other hand, if we're going to, on the Israeli side, Israel, of course, welcomed this decision. In a tweet, their foreign minister thanked the Trump administration for this step.
I mean, part of the issue here is the inherent conflict of the UN being headquartered in New York in the first place, right? There's supposed to be this firewall between the interests of the Americans and the UN. You mentioned the UN headquarters agreement. It states that foreign officials should be able to come to New York for meetings irrespective of relations between their governments and the United States. Yet this isn't the first time something like this has happened.
The U.S. did that once before to a Palestinian leader. In 1988, the Reagan administration refused to allow the then head of the PLO, Yasser Arafat, to come to New York. So the UNGA voted to move the conference to Geneva, Switzerland.
At the UN, the PLO was granted an observer status in 1974. It was not a member state, but it had like an observer mission status. Congress in December of 1987 passed the Anti-Terrorism Act. And it attempted through that act to actually close the observer mission here in New York. And a year later, in 1988, there was a court ruling by a U.S. district judge against the U.S. government, stating that this act cannot override the headquarters treaty. And the Reagan administration did not appeal it. So the mission remained open after the ruling from the court.
We'll have more with Biesan after a break. So, Biesan, why don't we keep the history rolling? Because I do think that the context matters a lot here. And I want to play one of the more iconic moments in the UN General Assembly's history. We're going back to 1974, when former Palestinian President Yasser Arafat delivered what's known as the olive branch speech.
I have come to you, Mr. President, bearing the olive branch in one hand and the freedom fighter's gun in the other hand. Do not let the green branch fall from my hand.
So maybe we can tap into your deep well of knowledge on this subject, and you can tell us a little bit about the role that the UN has played in the struggle for Palestinian rights and maybe how it's changed over time.
Right now, whenever we speak about the UN, it's more in critical terms, just because of the failure of the Security Council to take any, measure, and like all of the Security Council resolutions that have not been implemented since, over the past 50, 60
but was that always the
years?
case? It seems like we're so negative now, but back in the day, it was actually a platform. I mean, is that fair to say?
Yeah, it is a platform. And at the end of the day, in 1949, UNRWA was created, and that was it played a key role when it came to Palestinian refugees. You have a lot of programs, a lot of Palestinians in refugee camps. They were educated through UNRWA programs. Like UN agencies have worked and helped Palestinians. The thing is, when it comes to, I guess, peacemaking, it comes down to the Security Council. And yes, the Security Council has issued numerous resolutions calling for ceasefires and addressing the situation since 1948. But right now, a lot of the resolutions were not implemented. And what we've seen in the past 2 years with Gaza, a lot of these resolutions have either not passed because of the veto, or if a resolution passed, it was not implemented.
How do you think that Arafat's olive branch speech helped legitimize the Palestinian political claims and help rally kind of support on this issue, the kind of legacy of that speech we see today?
So, as you mentioned, Arafat, as the head of the PLO, was invited in 1974 to address the UN General Assembly. At the time, of course, the speech was interrupted by applause by representatives at the time of the Soviet bloc, East Asian nations, African countries. And if we're going to speak about the legacy of the speech, the legacy has been actually the UN granting a non-state observer status to the PLO. After the closing line of that speech, where Arafat says that he is here carrying and bearing an olive branch. So it led to this observer status.
So there's a growing choir of voices calling for the UN's headquarters to move outside of the West. In fact, the UN itself is moving a lot of its major agencies as part of the so-called UN 80 reform agenda to decentralize operations to a more cost-effective region of the world, perhaps. Do you expect those calls to grow louder in the wake of this?
It could be a possibility that these voices become louder. But as you mentioned, the UN is also facing a very challenging time. The UN 80, which is this major reform initiative that has been launched March of this year by the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, to make the UN more cost effective, especially in the face of tremendous budget cuts and strains that the UN is facing.
An internal review the UN chief has ordered could mean radical reorganization, cutbacks and job losses. First reported by Reuters this week. It comes as cuts slashing US foreign aid introduced as part of Trump's cost-cutting drive led by Elon Musk have hit the UN hard.
When it comes to even UNRWA, this year's UNRWA, just last week, the spokesperson for the UN Secretary General was asked if there were any plans to move the high-level meeting to Geneva. Of course, this also goes back to the General Assembly. So, I mean, as of now, we don't know of any plans, but this is something that's also a source of speculation that you hear in the hallways from diplomats and journalists themselves asking that question.
Okay, so as we wrap up, Biesan, you've been covering the UN for a long time, and we've seen protests increase in recent years, protests against not just Israel, but the UN itself. Is it fair to say that a story like this fuels these negative perceptions of the UN and UNRWA in particular? I mean, some critics argue the UN struggles to take meaningful action, especially when its most powerful members are involved. Could there be lasting damage from a scandal like this?
Yes, we've already seen announcements and calls for protests happening here at UNRWA on Palestine, and on the day Netanyahu will be speaking here, especially that there is an arrest warrant that you had mentioned before by the ICC for Netanyahu and against the genocide and the starvation. So the criticism towards the UN will probably still be there, but from the UN side, they are also facing a lot of constraints when it comes to what has happened in Gaza and the limitations in terms of delivering aid, the budget cuts, the cost cuts, these kind of restraints. One argument is that the Security Council can take measures under Chapter 7 when it comes to a situation where peace and security is being threatened. But of course, with the veto, any effort that is similar to that will probably be blocked. So it's this push and pull that you see. And if you have watched Security Council meetings over the past year, especially on Gaza, you can hear it in the voices of diplomats and ambassadors when they're giving their statements, that they feel that their hands are tied because of the veto. And the frustration is raising more and more and more in their speeches and in the violations to international law that's happening in Gaza. And just, the last meeting that was held at the UN last week on the Palestinian question, diplomats were almost in tears with the pictures of children starving in Gaza. But at the end of the day, there's also that frustration that it feels that there's so much that they can do.
I mean, because it's important to place this in its present context. This genocide happening in Gaza will be talked about in history the same way we talk about Rwanda or Bosnia. And you have this huge crisis happening in the present. And then at the same time, you have this incredibly petty move to bar these people from even attending the UN General Assembly. And people feel completely powerless because the only two people that matter are Israel and the United States in this context. Very frustrating. It sounds like the UN itself is aware that it's starting to show its age. I mean, it's UN 80, right? It's an 80-year-old institution, and it's either going to find a way to modernize and become relevant, or it's going to go away, or it's just going to slip into irrelevance. I mean, is that something that you hear from the people that you talk to who work at the UN, who attend these delegation conferences?
Definitely. And I think UN reform is a major issue and priority for clearly the Secretary General, since he has launched this, but also at the same time for member states. And we hear that from a lot of countries that this is a very important issue that needs to be tackled. Member states, diplomats, when you talk to them, this is one of the issues that they mention as a priority, especially in terms of recognizing the importance, of the UN on the world stage, so that this reform and these initiatives need to be considered.
Okay. Biesan, thank you so much for coming on The Take today.
Thank you very much for having me.
And that's The Take. If you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to give it a like so more people can find it. And I'd really love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Let me know what stood out to you, or if there's anything you'd like us to cover next time. I'm always checking in, so let's keep the conversation going. We'll see you tomorrow.